What's up, guys? This is Preheat coming at you with another video. Today what we're going to be discussing are the top 5 things that I am least looking forward to in Shadowlands. So mainly systems that I have a problem with and changes to the game that I am not looking forward to. This is a continuation of my previous video, my top 10 favorite changes coming. Before it was the pros, now we're talking about the cons. I'm going to try and keep it constructive. I don't want to just talk about things and not really give my reasons why I think they're a problem. And I'm also going to be discussing this from a top-end Raiders perspective and also from the perspective of someone who maybe might be more casual at the game, why it might be an issue for them as well. But before we get started, there's actually huge news that I would be remiss to not speak about right now. Shadowlands has been delayed as of 2 days ago. So if you are somehow unaware of this, if you've been living under a rock, yes, Shadowlands will be delayed. It looks like it's going to be coming out later this year. If you're wondering what my take on that is, I am so happy about this. Seriously, this is like the best news. It's literally a dream come true. If you want to know how much of a nerd I am, I literally have had dreams that Shadowlands was getting delayed, and they were really good dreams, and I would wake up whenever I'd have one of these dreams and I would just believe it to be true, check my phone, check Discord, and then end up finding out it was all a dream, and I would be super sad. This happened multiple times. So, you know, it's got me so messed up that it's in my head that deep, right, in the subconscious. But yes, Blizzard has actually decided to delay the game. As someone who beta tests the game very aggressively, I feel like this was absolutely 110% the correct decision. And you know what? Honestly, it's pretty awesome, and I think that it definitely deserves some respect talking about it. You know, it definitely couldn't have been easy for whoever it was who had to go in and talk to the Activision shareholders to tell them that they would be doing this, right? So really huge kudos to Blizzard for delaying the game. It is not in a state that's ready to go out the door. There are a lot of things that still need to be iterated on and changed and fleshed out. However, you know, we're going to have to see some progress in some areas, or else this delay really won't do much, right? And we'll get into why I feel that way and which systems I'm discussing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so coming in at number 1 is going to be Covenants, to no one's surprise. This is literally the thing that every single person who plays this game at a high level is complaining about. This is the thing that you hear most complaints about on, you know, basically every streamer or content creator's channel. You know, Covenants are they're really a system that encourages you to choose. It's meant to be more of a traditional kind of RPG choice where you're kind of dedicating a part of your character to this choice, right? And it definitely seems to be something that's been marketed as like a, you know, new and interesting step for Blizzard. However, there are a lot of issues with tying player power to choice, and that really is at the core of what is wrong with Covenants. So if you aren't aware of how Conduits work, basically once your character hits max level in Shadowlands, you will need to make a decision basically right away. You're going to have to pledge fealty to one of the 4 different Covenants that are available to you. They all have a completely different aesthetic. They all have different armors. They all have different weapons. They all have different mounts. Everything about them is very different. Their zones are different, which is all great, right? All that stuff is cool and great. But the one thing that really isn't great is they all have different abilities too and different power. So if you're someone who believes that this game can be balanced perfectly, if you're someone who rationally believes that Blizzard can balance everything in World of Warcraft and make everything equal, then obviously you won't have an issue with player power being tied behind Conduits, right? However, this is not the case, and it has really never been the case. There's really no historic evidence to show that this game is able to be balanced at that level, or, you know, maybe even that it needs to be balanced at that level. The issue arises whenever you're locked into decisions, and those decisions dictate how powerful your character is, and especially when those decisions are then changed after the fact. If they get balanced later on, you know, obviously that's going to make a lot of people upset if they're completely locked down into one of the Covenants, right? So being able to swap Covenants would probably fix this issue just straight away. If your favorite Covenant gets nerfed and it's not as good as another Covenant, or maybe you just picked the wrong one, you know, you would be able to make that choice and swap around. And it seems like Blizzard is kind of making some accommodations for swapping. They're basically saying it is possible to swap, but you'll just lose your progress, and also you won't be able to go back, right? At least not easily. They're adding essentially a cooldown to being able to move back to a covenant you previously left, and you basically like grovel and atone and do all these quests and stuff to get back in. But I think all of this is just really strange and inconsistent with what we're actually being portrayed in the game. Like in the actual story, and I know a lot of people don't care about the story, I especially don't, right? But I do notice things, right? In the story, basically you are told that you're like the one person who can traverse them all. You're basically a big deal. You're kind of a big deal, and you do all this stuff for all these covenants, and you essentially go around from place to place to place solving all their problems, and you get renowned for it, right? This is your typical RPG fare. You go from place to place, you do great things, people enjoy what you do, and you get praise and accommodations, and then you move on to the next adventure, right? And then at the very end, all the covenants kind of tell you, you know, oh, you're the guy who fixed all of our stuff. Basically, you can do whatever you want, and everything is well and good. But then once you're done with all of that, you get a quest that tells you have to pick one. And after you pick your covenant, you still have world quests and stuff that deal with other covenants. Like, people are still asking you for help. However, you can't tap into any of their power anymore. And also, if you were to leave a covenant and go to a different covenant and then try to move back, apparently they just don't even want to talk to you anymore. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense at all, to me at least. And I think it just seems to be like a convenient way to try and say that this choice actually matters. The whole point of covenants being a impactful choice, right? Could just be in the aesthetic of the covenant. It could just be the mounts and the way your character looks and the weapons and all that stuff. I mean, it's cool that they're theming this stuff around covenants. The problem is that they're tying player power to these covenants, right? And certain covenants are good for certain things. Even if your covenants are completely laid out in front of you and you know exactly which one you're going to want for PvP, which one you're going to want for raiding, which one you're going to want for dungeons, and so on, etc., right? There are people, believe it or not, who enjoy all of those things, right? Every single week. They enjoy doing all of the things I listed every single week. And for those folks, they will always feel handicapped by their decision because they chose to go with one covenant that's great at one thing, and now they're just subsequently worse at all the other things, right? Really, to just kind of put it concisely, I think that it is a choice-based issue, and the amount of options available to you are leaving other options unavailable. And really, to me, that feels more impactful. It's not about what you have, it's about what you don't have access to anymore, right? You pick a covenant, it's not about what you have with that covenant, it's about what you know you're missing out on with all of the other covenants. And that really is, I guess, the core issue for me. Now, for someone like me who is in a high-end guild and is going to clear the raid much quicker than the average player, this problem actually isn't that bad for me. I can choose the covenant that I need to for raiding, and then in about, 2 weeks after the raid releases, I'm going to be done, and I can just go whatever covenant I want, and it won't matter anymore, right? And if there are decisions that I have to make where I need multiple covenants, I can just level multiple characters, right? I don't mind doing that. It's fine. So for me as a high-end raider, this actually doesn't really affect me all that much. In fact, I would argue that it probably affects the average player much more, since the average player is going to be locked into whatever, their routine is for longer, right? If you're an average player, you might be a CE guild that kills the boss a couple weeks before the end of the first patch, right? And in that case, you're basically locked into whatever raiding covenant you need that whole time. And you're not going to be able to do dungeons as efficiently. You're not going to be able to do PvP as efficiently. All your friends who don't raid like you do, if you want to go play with them, they're all going to be saying, hey man, it would be really cool if you were this one covenant so we could skip this trash pack in this dungeon, but it looks like you're not, so, we're just going to have to work around that, right? Maybe you invis, maybe you die, whatever it is, right? I'm just saying, like, there are a lot of things that are bound to covenants, even when it comes to, like, a super micro level of, like, you can use, Death's Door to basically do skips in dungeons, right? So, I don't think that there's going to be a way to balance this at all. I think even if numerically it was all balanced to be equal, there would still be cases, right? Like AoE, single target, dungeons, PvP, raiding. Like, they're not going to be able to balance this stuff unless it's all just the same move recolored in different ways, which is boring and dumb. So I think the best way to fix this is just to allow you to choose your covenant abilities separately from which covenant you're actually pledged to. We will get to see how all this covenant stuff ends up shaping up. Ultimately, though, I think that locking player power behind covenants and making players make that decision and having that decision be almost set in stone is a big mistake. And that's why it's going to be my number one in terms of the issues I have with Shadowlands. All right, now that that's over, let's talk about number two. So my number two issue with Shadowlands has to do with how conduits work. So we're not talking about conduits specifically. What I'm talking about, my issue is with conduits having a weekly lockout. So for those of you who aren't aware of what a conduit is essentially a glyph. If you haven't been playing World of Warcraft long enough to know what glyphs are, they used to be this thing that you would place in to basically like a tree of secondary talents that would give you differing effects on your spells. They would mostly be just damage increases, but you know, every once in a while you get something that would actually be a playstyle change as well. So this is just like a small decision that you're making in addition to your talents. They're kind of just like the light version of talents in a way. So in Shadowlands, conduits have actually been tied to the expansion system of covenants, which also I don't like. I don't like whenever systems in expansion are all just built up just to be torn down once the expansion is over. But that's a whole different conversation. Basically, conduits are a way to give certain abilities more damage. Most of them are centered around just plain abilities, but there are other conduits that specifically focus on your covenant abilities as well. Those ones are locked to that specific covenant, whereas the others are just free regardless of what conduit you have. Conduits start at level 1, and you level them up, and they gain power as you level them. The way that you level them is mostly unknown. Right now, it seems like there's just an item that you buy that upgrades a random conduit. And if you don't have a conduit learned, it has the choice to also just give you a random conduit as well. But there seem to also be ways to get actual leveled up conduits of a specific type to drop, be it in your dungeons, be it in your raids, and different difficulties of dungeons and raids actually give you different conduits. So the level of the conduit is actually tied to the difficulty of the content you're doing, which so far so good is fine, right? The problem arises when you lock players into having certain conduits in their tree, because that's going to lead to a situation where, let's say a player gets an upgrade, right? And that upgrade could be just as impactful as getting a new weapon or a new piece of gear, right? But whenever they go to equip this new upgrade, in this case, placed a new conduit into your soulbind, they aren't able to. And the reason why they aren't able to is because there is this really strange weekly lockout to setting your soul binds. I don't understand why there's a weekly lockout to set your soul binds. This is, so if we look at it from the perspective of Blizzard, originally conduits were destroyed when you removed them. So if you took a conduit out, you destroyed it and you could replace it with a new one. Players didn't like this, so Blizzard said, okay, cool. Well, we'll let you learn the conduits permanently, but we'll add a weekly lockout to placing the conduits in your tree. Honestly, when I heard this, I just scratched my head. It's like they completely missed the problem. Players are having an issue with this because you're making it convoluted. You're making it so that there's random restrictions added to this that don't seem necessary. I mean, realistically, this is literally glyphs. We've already had this before, right? Why are you making this so complicated, and why are you restricting players' ability to play the game the way they want to? But here we are. So with conduits, basically, once you place a conduit into your tree, you are locked into having that conduit in that place until you reset your conduits, which you can only do once per week. Okay, so I've talked about the problem. Let's talk about what the impact will be. So I suspect that the impact of conduits having a weekly lockout will lead to players doing one of two things. Either they will choose the best in slot conduits regardless of the level, and they'll just leave them in that tree and they will not change the conduits. They won't experiment, because experimentation, remember, carries a weekly lockout. If you go one direction and it's not better, you can't go back for a whole week, right? So players will not experiment at all. They will feel like they are forced into having one specific way, and this is going to make it even more cookie cutter of a system than you could ever try and do by designing the game around it that way, right? So if the idea of player choice is the most important thing to you, putting conduits on a weekly lockout will actually discourage that actively. Player choice will be worse for it if you have a weekly lockout on conduits. All right. Now, the number two thing players might do is they might just say that they don't care, right? You know, players who have a conduit that, let's say, isn't as great as another conduit, they just might not play the game as much because they know that during the time that they have that conduit in their tree and they're locked out of changing it, they're going to be not as effective. Imagine that you want to parse, right? Let's say that you're the kind of player who wants to parse and you want that 100 percentile for the week, but you did some dungeons earlier and you put in a conduit in there and it's an AoE conduit and you're doing single target bosses, right? Well, what this will probably lead to is you just not caring as much because you know that, you know, getting your perfect damage out is going to be something out of reach, right? So I think that overall, this will probably cause players to just approach the game with more maybe apprehension, or maybe they'll be more apathetic about how they're doing because they know that, you know, basically you can't have fun. You're going to be punished if you want to enjoy multiple areas of the game. Yeah, so overall with Conduits, I feel like this is just another way for Blizzard to enforce a certain playstyle on the players. And I think that the idea of it being a player choice is actually almost a paradox, right? Because by making this a more, I guess, set in stone decision, right? What you're doing is you're actively discouraging players to experiment, and you're also actively discouraging players from enjoying multiple facets of the game because they will always be less efficient in the things that they aren't currently slotted for than whatever is optimal, right? And players in World of Warcraft are always going to chase what's optimal. That's just the meta in MMOs, right? So having something like this that is a pure RPG element, having something that you choose once and then your character's just that way for the rest of your playstyle is great in a single target game. It's great in the game where you have fun and you play through and then you make a new character, right? But in MMOs, we play our characters for decades, right? And we play them with other people and we're expected to perform, right? Like we want to be good, like not just for ourselves, we want to be better for our team as well, right? For the people that we play with. And having this, you know, pure RPG element that locks you into something, or having it be overly restrictive, to me just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so my third complaint about Shadowlands actually has to deal with legendaries. Now, we've already talked about legendaries and why they're great, and the ability to choose which slot you put your legendary power on and what stats are on the legendary. All that stuff is great, right? Like giving players the ability to choose how they build the items out that are going to be so impactful to them and have that progression and that buy-in is fantastic, right? But my issue with legendaries is that they have an item level associated with them. And in order to upgrade a legendary, you actually just recraft it, right? So I feel like maybe legendaries should have a separate item that's used to upgrade them once you've already crafted them. You know, you should still be able to recraft a legendary if you want to have different stats on them. That's totally fine. But, you know, recrafting the legendary to get in a higher item level version of the item is just not great to me. And I feel like it'll probably lead to most players just kind of hoarding their points instead of expanding their wardrobes of legendaries that they use, right? Which I think would just be better. Okay, so number 4 is going to be a little weird. This is actually kind of the culmination of all the other things, and I feel like I need to talk about it specifically because this is something that kind of transcends any of these specific systems we've discussed so far. Number 4 for me, my fourth biggest grievance with the expansion, Shadowlands, is choice-based issues. So specifically, we are talking about instances where the player choice to do something is impactful and therefore must be, you know, set in stone in a certain way, or maybe it has to be, you know, something that's hard to unchoose, right? Essentially, you're setting up situations in all of these systems, conduits, covenants, legendaries, you're setting up all of them so that once a player chooses one thing, it's not readily available to have the other things as well. And I totally get it from a pure RPG standpoint why this is a good thing, right? If you have a game like Fallout, it makes sense to have hard choices that basically build your character a certain way, okay? And that can be fun because you play those games and then you're done with them and maybe you make a new character and you do a different build, right? This is just a further customization option for your character. But in an MMO, these kind of things don't really make any sense whatsoever, right? The way that people play MMOs in 2020 is much different than they played them back in 2004. And it's also much different than the way they play RPGs, right? a lot of people say these are RPG elements and World of Warcraft is an MMORPG. But I think the more important letters in MMORPG are actually the first three. Because MMOs carry a certain kind of playstyle. There is a certain meta in MMOs. People chase whatever is optimal. People chase whatever the best players are doing. This is just how people play MMOs, right? And ultimately, the decisions in how you're going to build your character are going to be more impacted by what the best players say or what the theory crafters say, whatever all the guides online say, than any decision that players will make on their own ever, right? If you think that players are all going to be choosing how to build their character based off of their intuition, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, there are certainly players who do this, right? There are players out there who play World of Warcraft and don't look up anything and just play the game they want to. But they are the overwhelming minority. I think it's pretty safe to argue that most players do not play this game by just building their character exactly the way that their gut tells them to do it without looking up anything online or being informed at all. And if you want proof of this, you can literally go look at Warcraft logs and look at how many people are playing arcane mages, right? I guarantee you it isn't just people liking fire mage because fire is cool. It has more to do with the fact that fire overperforms compared to the other mage specs, right? And this is just one example, but you can see that basically there is a meta and people chase the meta in video games. And especially in games that are online, people will chase that meta even harder. You're not just your own character. You can't just build your guy a certain way because it's the way you like to play your guy, because you got 19 other people who are relying you on that raid. Or maybe you've got 4 other friends who want to do dungeons with you. Or maybe there's just one friend that just wants to PvP with you and wishes that you would, you know, actually use the right talents for PvP. Maybe you'd have a better win ratio, right? So ultimately in MMOs, people chase whatever the meta is. People chase whatever the best players are doing. And that's why people always ask me what I'm going to be playing in Shadowlands, which covenant I'm going to be, what spec I'm going to be, right? This is the most common question I get in my chat. And it isn't because people just want to know because they're just interested in me. It's because they want to know for their own sake, because they want to copy what I'm doing. And this is true for basically every content creator out there, right? So yeah, having pure RPG elements in an MMO in this day and age, just to me, it doesn't make any sense. And maybe having these choices be so impactful where you can't choose the other thing without, you know, swift penalties, is actually limiting player choice as opposed to opening up the doors for more experimentation, more gameplay decisions, and enjoying the full game instead of just enjoying 1/4 of the game. Okay, and number 5. All right, so this is another one of those that's just a little bit metaphorical, right? So far we've talked about covenants, we've talked about conduits, we've talked about how they interact with soulbinds, we've talked about legendaries, we've talked about player choice in general. So this final one, we're going to be talking about how the game is balanced. So this is something that is always a problem in World of Warcraft. Literally always a problem. There will never be perfect balancing in any MMO. No matter how much game developers attempt to balance the game, obviously balance is something that is very, very hard to achieve. However, in Shadowlands, because we have increased the amount of choices for players, right? We have all of these other systems built upon other systems that we already have, like talents, like your spec, you know, what sort of stats you are running, right? There are so many choices that basically all add like another order of magnitude of complexity to how many different combinations there are, right? And you could argue that having this many choices is good, but I would actually disagree. I think that the increase of options leads to buyer's remorse, and there's actually a lot of studies that support this, right? When it comes to real life situations, so having this many choices isn't necessarily a good thing. And when it comes to balancing the game, it's actually a really, really bad thing. You don't want to have this many choices in your MMO, okay? Because it's already hard to balance things, but now you're adding orders of magnitude of complexity to the amount of different combinations that are available, right? And essentially, I mean, you can just look at a good example from Simcraft, right? Like look at a Simcraft readout of different choices and compare it to a Shadowlands one, right? Where, you know, the amount of talents that you have and which spec you're playing is going to be multiplied by how many conduits there are, how many covenants there are, How many different... All right, so let's just use an example, okay? So let's talk about SimCraft, for instance, right? So the amount of different combinations available if you want to sim every possible combination of covenants, conduits, soulbinds, legendaries, talents, specialization, and skill stat preferences. Okay, so let's just use an example here. We're going to be talking about... okay, so let's just use an example here to kind of illustrate this point. So if you're looking at SimCraft and you're trying to figure out what the best way to play your character is and the best stats to have and the best combination of covenants and conduits and soulbinds and legendaries and all that is, you're going to want to create profile sets, right? So a profile set is essentially a loadout that shows this is just one of many different loadouts, but this one is specific to having, you know, X, Y, Z, conduit, soulbind, legendary, etc., etc., okay? And you have this long list of profiles that you need to run calculations for. Well, in Shadowlands, because you've got your talents, because you've got your specialization, because you've got conduits, because you've got covenants, because you've got soulbinds, different combinations of soulbinds, different paths of soulbinds, and then you've also got legendaries on top of that, you've got a lot of different combinations, right? And because there are so many combinations, that is going to lead to a situation where balance is harder. This is a fact. There's no way around it. If you have more combinations, then balancing those combinations will ultimately be harder for you. So the reason why balance is on my radar, the reason why I'm concerned about class balance is because I feel like Blizzard might have bitten off more than they can chew. Now, this isn't just evidenced by the fact that they delayed the game, right? I know that part of them delaying Shadowlands had to do with balance, but probably not all of it. Probably most of it had to do with the systems that they hadn't completed and really fleshed out yet, right? But balance has to be part of this equation. And because Blizzard is setting up a situation where they're saying that we can balance it publicly in interviews, and because they have so many things to balance, I feel like there's just really no way feasibly that this is going to end well. I feel like the amount of choices that they are giving us are too high. I feel like the increase of options is going to lead to buyer's remorse from players. People are going to have remorse for the decisions that they made. And I feel like ultimately, Shadowlands is going to feel like a great expansion with a lot of great improvements that was ultimately hindered by the systems and the complexity of how it was presented. And ultimately, these are all things that can be fixed easily. This is why I'm making this video. This is my call to arms. I really would love to see Shadowlands succeed. World of Warcraft is something that I'm very passionate about. And hopefully that is something that you're also passionate about. So if you like this game and if you want to see this stuff fixed, I would urge you to be constructive in your criticism, but be vocal, right? And talk about this stuff. And if you agree with things that I've said in this video and you want to see these changes get made, you need to obviously be vocal, but do not ever make the mistake of being aggressive or being rude to the people who are spending the time to actually design and fix the problems in this game. People who work on these projects obviously care about them a lot too. If you come off as frothing at the mouth angry, right, you are actually hurting your own chances of having your comment read by someone who actually has the ability to fix the thing that you're complaining about. People just generally are more receptive to criticism as long as it is presented in a way that, you know, isn't overly aggressive towards them, right? And I think that this is just true in everyday life. It's common sense, right? Like, it's literally common sense. If you want to give someone advice and you want them to do something a certain way, being overly aggressive about it is probably not going to get you what you want unless you hold some sort of sway over that person, right? And in this case, you don't hold sway over Blizzard. Telling them that you're going to unsub because they're, you know, messing up the game, that's not productive, right? So anyways, I just want to include this message in the video just because I feel like I've talked about a lot of this stuff and I've been very passionate about it. And I feel like maybe some people might not realize that the way that they come off is actually important whenever they're talking about this stuff online. I really do think that there is a good chance that Blizzard comes through on some of these things. I mean, just look at the fact that they delayed Shadowlands, right? Shadowlands needed to be delayed. Everyone knew it. At least the people who were, you know, playing the beta actively knew it. And I would say that most of us probably didn't expect Blizzard to actually delay the game, right? This kind of came out of left field. And I'm really excited, and it actually gives me a lot of hope for this expansion. So I want to end this video on a hopeful point. I really do think that these things can easily be solved. All it takes is just a couple things, right? So first off, make covenants. They don't have to necessarily be swappable, but allow for players to choose the covenant abilities individually, right? Kind of like a talent system, similar to how you choose your talents in the Wowhead tool, right? If you go to the very bottom, you can choose your covenant loadout. So that's the first thing I would say. The number 2 thing would be allow covenants to be swapped on the fly as long as you're in your covenant hole, right? If you make the trip out there, you should be able to swap them. Don't, you know, if you want to keep it kind of restricted where players have to go to a certain place to do it, that's totally fine, right? Just don't lock them out for a whole week. That doesn't make sense. Don't do that. No one likes having to wait a week to play the character the way that they want to play it. It just doesn't make any sense, okay? And then legendaries, I feel like this one's a really easy one to fix. All you have to do is just make it so that the ability to upgrade a legendary is independent of creating legendaries. I feel like this one might already even be in the works, right? We could probably see a small system change to fix this. And lastly, I feel like maybe scale down some of the systems, right? You bit off more than you can chew. You had to delay the game. Listen, I understand and I appreciate that you are delaying the game. That is great news, okay? And you have time to fix this stuff. Do yourself a favor and reduce the amount of stuff you need to fix just straight away, right? Maybe just cut a system entirely, right? I feel like that will be better than the other outcome where we just have so many systems and so many different combinations and you know, so many things, so many fires to put out where balance isn't even on the radar anymore, right? Because right now balance is not looking too great. And, you know, it is one of those situations where the ability to balance this game is going to be directly tied to how complex the systems are in the game. So if you reduce the amount of complexity, you're going to make balancing easier. Ultimately, you're going to have a better game. So anyways, thank you for watching this video. I know it was a long one and I've gotten into the weeds a little bit more than I thought I would. Now you can probably see why I kept it down to 5. But anyways, if you enjoy videos like this, then I urge you to subscribe to my channel and also maybe check me out on Twitch. I stream there. You can ask me questions, you know, whatever it is that you're thinking about, and I'll probably respond to your question. So anyways, thanks for watching the video. Smash that like button and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.